At this point, we've discussed a whole lot of phyla, but what I want to start talking about now are some that you're probably more familiar with. Now, we're going towards the direction of arthropods, meaning that we are still in bilateral symmetry, still 3 tissue layers, and still protostomes. Do you remember what all of these terms mean? When we look at Phylum Arthropoda, we have huge diversity. Now, in other phyla, we've talked about kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. But as you see from my diagram here, we actually go from kingdom to phylum to subphylum before we get to classes, and then they actually have many subclasses in arthropods. This should give you some clue about the diversity and just the sheer number of bugs that are out there, right? So when we look at arthropods, we focus on these subphyla, and that's what I want you to focus on. We'll look at these classes to give you some direction for what's in the subphylum, but the subphylum are what we want to focus on. And truly, you could take an entire class on arthropods. So we just want to kind of give you the surface basics of what's going on. We'll focus on 3 of the subphyla in particular, and when we look at these particular subphyla, we want to look at some of their special characteristics. So what are some of the special characteristics of arthropods? Well, first of all, they have an exoskeleton. Why is that so exciting? Well, remember, exo is outside, so this means that they have a skeleton on the outside. This is pretty cool, but it also means that we've got to deal with some very interesting characteristics associated with them, right? In particular, when we look at these organisms, we have the basic head, thorax, abdomen as we would expect, but we start adding more complexity. This exoskeleton is actually going to allow us to add complexity because we have better support structures. Think about a lobster, like in my picture here, compared to an earthworm. Think about structurally how that organism is going to use different components to survive. What about here? So this is an adorable little crab. When we look at him, he's shedding his exoskeleton. In order to grow, these organisms have to shed that exoskeleton. It's very hard. So which is which? Which is the exoskeleton and which is the actual animal? Well, if we go down to our bottom picture here, this is the exoskeleton, and the crab is actually backing out of its exoskeleton. Now, during this time, this crab is going to be at risk. Why? He's now soft. That exoskeleton is like a suit of armor. He's just backed out of his suit of armor, and now he has to wait a couple of days. And in that time, until his exoskeleton hardens again, he's actually quite vulnerable to predation. The other cool thing that arthropods add are these appendages that actually have muscles. So these jointed appendages with paired muscle groups allow the arthropods higher levels of movement, and certainly for something like our grasshopper here, they can jump pretty far, right? So the idea of these bilateral symmetry, 3 tissue layers, protostome development that we have with our arthropods, it is going to allow a lot more development of some of these criteria, some of these derived characters, and within this group, the derived characters are going to be some of the most important. You see from our picture here again, some of these are going to be aquatic, some will be terrestrial, some are going to be saltwater, some will be freshwater, some will live in deserts, some need moist environments. So it really is kind of all over the place. But typically we look at most of them as having a fairly short lifespan, so they don't live very long, but they reproduce in very, very high numbers. Let's look at a couple of these subphyla. In particular, we're going to focus on Uniramia, which gives us our bugs. We're going to look at Cheliceraceae, which gives us our spiders and so on. And then Crustacea, which I like to label as the yummy phylum. But we also have a fourth one here that you might notice, this extinct phyla over here with the trilobites. We've talked about trilobites before and how important they are in the fossil record. This is where they fall into our kingdom of Animalia. So with Uniramia, insects, bugs, millipedes, centipedes, look at this. 10 million species of bugs on this planet. There are 200 million bugs for every person on the planet. Just think about that. If we're at 7 billion people, do the math on how many bugs are running around. Not to gross you out, but there's also a lot of coevolution. We often talk about flowering plants with animals and coevolution, but we can also look at the interaction very specifically of insects in this interaction. So here are just a couple of examples: dragonflies, butterflies, millipedes, centipedes, and so on. Now, we do have within this subphylum typically 3 body segments: the normal head, thorax, and abdomen. And we've got an open circulatory system again. Remember, keeping track of some of these details is important, right? So this open circulatory system, meaning that the organs are going to be bathed in blood through sinuses, no true vessel system, and so on. And reproduction now is mainly sexual. So we've seen a lot of variety in the type of reproduction strategies throughout our animal kingdom, but these guys remain mainly sexual. So head, thorax, and abdomen, probably not a surprise to you. Remember, thorax is just chest kind of area. Typically is going to contain heart and lungs if appropriate, and so on, as opposed to the abdomen. We typically differentiate the digestive kinds of organs from the vital organs such as heart and lungs. Our millipedes and centipedes, just because they're kind of curious little things, that does not mean they have 1,000,000 legs or 1,000 legs, okay? We actually look with our millipedes as being 2 legs per segment, as opposed to our centipedes that are 1 pair of legs per segment. Now, when we look at these guys, people are typically pretty creeped out by crawling bugs, right? But this guy on the left, our millipede, is actually an herbivore. He has no interest in you. This is the guy over here that you need to be concerned about if you're going to be concerned about any of them. Centipedes are actually very strong carnivores. Cool. So why have the bugs or the insects been so successful over the years? Well, segmentation is a big one. We've talked about segmentation, not just those lines on the outside of the body, but internal division of structures. Exoskeleton, huge. Gives them supported structures. Even though they're vulnerable when they shed that exoskeleton, still great long term. Jointed appendages, huge. It means that running, swimming, flying, all possible. Flight itself. We don't look at any other phyla except reptiles and mammals within our chordates. We don't look at any other phyla as having flight. So this is pretty cool. They also have a waterproof cuticle. Now, yes, this is something we usually associate with plants, but being waterproof as a bug is really important. The last one that I want to mention to you is this idea of a fairly complex life cycle, in that many of these organisms are going to go through a complete metamorphosis from the time that they're a larvae until they're an adult. They have short generation times and huge numbers of offspring. That'll be important. They also have some terrific characteristics, right? Look at my variety of bugs here. I promise this is a bug, okay? Horned caterpillars, walking sticks. I promise, still a bug. But are you going to eat something that looks like bird poo? I don't think so. What about this guy? See this guy in here? He's kind of leaf-shaped. Again, he just blends right in. This camouflage is terrific. They go even further. We can look at camouflage selection through these kinds of mimicry ideas. So mimicry is copying, right? So we'll look at this more in ecosystems and evolution things later on, population dynamics. But this idea of mimicking a predator if you're a prey item is pretty ingenious. They take it even further. Look at all these bugs. You wouldn't mess with these things. They look like pit vipers, right? But I promise they're just the back end of a caterpillar. How cool is that? So Crustacea, or the yummy phyla, actually include shrimp and lobsters and so on. The important part here is we get more appendage variability. So looking at both antennae kinds of things, feeding appendages, many of them have swimming appendages, right, associated with them. But they range in size. A water flea is only going to be on the order of about 3/4 of an inch. Shrimp, fairly small. Barnacles, fairly small. But we can certainly build up to much more complex organisms in this subphyla as well. Crabs and lobsters and so on fit into this. The diversity in the jointed appendages becomes much more clear here, and we have to think about how that may help them to evolve. And we'll think more about this with ecosystem structures. Chelacerata, or our subphyla that includes our spiders and ticks and so on. They're named this because they have two small appendages, chelicerae, that are actually near the mouth and have pinchers, and many of them are venom-based. So, a couple of examples of our chelaceratae. Now, they also range in size quite significantly. Look at our dust mite here, only 420 micrometers. Versus our scorpion, 8 centimeters or so long. Now, we are certainly not looking at giant organisms here, but when you bring venom into the mix, this becomes a much more serious sort of encounter, right? I mentioned the term metamorphosis to you. More than 80% of our insect species actually undergo a complete metamorphosis, meaning they're born as a slug-like larvae and develop into big, beautiful things. Think about the caterpillar that turns into a butterfly, the maggot that turns into a fly, all of these sorts of things. Others will go through some sort of incomplete metamorphosis where they don't have a complete transition, but we don't usually see a pupa involved. So the difference here is an incomplete metamorphosis has no pupa. So there's no resting stage. Remember, to go from a caterpillar to a butterfly, the caterpillar encloses itself in a pupa. The adult then emerges from that pupa or case, right? We don't see that in incomplete metamorphosis. So just an example of a complete metamorphosis for you in the European rhinoceros beetle, going from this kind of larva grub sort of thing into this pupa stage, and then eventually into our adult. He's pretty cute, huh?